What's up everyone, this is Pete and welcome back to the Carrot Poker School Grade 1. Welcome to Grade 1 Lecture 7. Today's topic is turn barrel opportunities and how to simplify our strategy to just one sizing in position on the turn when barreling. I think this is a very important thing to do. Sometimes people try to run before they can walk in poker and end up studying with a solver in a fairly counterproductive and overly complicated way in which they're using way too many inputs and trying to replicate a strategy that's just A, not always going to be best in practice anyway, and B, too complicated for a human, any human, really regardless of skill level, to be able to apply properly. So a much more important way of studying the game is to create a game tree in which there's only one sizing in position for your range on the turn. This doesn't mean that you're betting every hand that sizing, it just means that that's the sort of weapon that you're taking to the spot, and if you do decide to fire, that's the weapon you'll be firing. That's the analogy I like to think about. So we can decide on a toolkit, meaning a bet size that we will apply if we're betting before we actually decide whether we're betting our hand, and that can actually help us define a bit better where our value range begins and ends, where our bluffs begin and end, and just help us with the range crafting overall. Last time, we discussed at great length the tricky but very key and important concepts of range and nut advantage in turn barrel opportunities. Today, we're going to apply these further. I'm going to show you a very confusing looking figure that's going to put you off learning poker forever. It's going to make you quit the Carrot Poker School. Actually, I'm just kidding. This figure is really simple when you break it down, but it's going to look like a complete nonsense diagram when it first comes on your screen. So just ignore it when it first comes down, okay? And I'll explain it. There we go. See? Nonsense. But actually, this diagram is really important because it shows you the natural ebb and flow of ranges on the flop and then after some flop action. So I'll start off by just introducing what's going on here chronologically. The yellow arrow just signifies time moving forwards from the beginning of the hand, which is pre-flop, but after the pre-flop action has happened. We're going to start our assessment of button versus big blind, the equity and nut prevalence for both ranges here, the button raiser and the big blind caller in a single raise pot. And we're going to start our assessment of this after the pre-flop action has happened, but before the flop comes down. This is what these values here are going to mean. Then the flop comes down, the values change. I'll go over this in just a second. Then action happens. There's a check by big blind. Nothing changes there because that's a procedural check. Big blind checks the button, of course, with 100% of range in most cases on this board. Button then bets and stuff happens, big blind then calls and more stuff happens, the turn comes and then more stuff will happen in the future. So effectively, pre-flop here we can see that the red and yellow boxes here in our legend, in our key, these refer to buttons' equity of range against big blind's range and nut prevalence respectively. So as we can see pre-flop, button's equity is higher here before the flop comes down than the equity of big blind here. I won't always show in this diagram a completely accurate picture, so as one range increases its equity, the other range's equity will go down, but sometimes I just depict that by moving one of the values, just to make it clear that that's the player's action that's caused the change. And the green box here is big blind's nut prevalence. So big blind basically has less concentrated amounts of nutted combos pre-flop. The nutted combos pre-flop are, of course, aces, kings, queens, jacks to a lesser extent, maybe tens, but not so much. I think ace-king suited is not a nutted hand pre-flop. It's a hand that is an incredibly powerful hand. It has a lot of showdown value on loads of boards where it doesn't hit. It obviously has like the best pair draws ever and has really high implied odds. I mean, I think Doyle Brunson once referred to ace-king as a drawing hand. I don't think that's quite right, but there are elements that it's drawing to a very good pair. So in a sense, yes, Doyle can have that one. But anyway, when the flop comes down here, what we see is that because this flop is actually a bit of a better flop, as flops go generally for big blind. The jack is not a great card, but it is two-tone, which helps big blind catch up a bit against the very big pairs in button's range. And also there are a 6 and a 3 here, cards that are low enough down that they will tend to connect with the concentration of lower cards in big blind's range a little bit better than they'll connect with the bigger cards in button's range. So I think overall, this is one of the slightly better than average flops for big blind's equity. Like, I think big blind will still be an underdog on this flop, equity-wise, but not as much as he or she will be on some other flops. And that's why I've actually depicted the equity for button going down when this flop comes out and the equity for big blind going up. I think there's a catching up effect that occurs on a board like this because the board could well have been 9 deuce deuce or ace king 4 or king jack 3 or something that's like really good for button. So if you just imagine this flop being slightly better than average for big blind. Secondly, the nut prevalence in big blind's range actually goes down further here. Why is this? Well, if the flop had been ace deuce deuce, big blind is going to catch up in terms of nut advantage because he's going to neutralize kings, queens, and jacks like completely, and they're no longer going to be nutty hands in any way, shape, or form. So button's actually going to lose the monopoly on the nutted hands on a flop such as ace deuce deuce or a paired board like 10-10-9, where trips just leapfrog all of the overpairs from pre-flop. Similarly, if the flop was monotone, or 7-8-6 or 9-7-5 or something, the nut prevalence would go up in big blind's range. Because Jack 6-3 is very difficult to actually overtake an overpair on, the two pair combos in this flop are extremely scarce, and therefore the only real common way that big blind catches up with the nutted region here of button's range is by hitting a set. Hitting sixes, hitting threes. These hands don't come around very often. They're 6 combos of a range that's going to be 300-400 combos. So the conclusion here when it comes to nut prevalence is that the overpairs like this board. This is a board that button could use a big sizing on because big blind has not neutralized the nut advantage enough to make the investment ceiling for button lower on average by the end of the hand. So there are very many hands in button's range that still have 80% plus equity. And remember, on a two-tone board, 80% is quite a lot because some of the 20% that big blind has here is not in the form of beating button, but a lot of it's just in the form of having a flush draw. Obviously, flush draws have more than 20%, but you get the picture, that evens it out. So overall, nut prevalence goes down on this flop. Okay, what happens next is that big blind checks the flop and nothing changes at this point because big blind has checked all of their range over to the button. The next action is a B33 from button, and I mentioned that button could bet big on this spot. He can also bet smaller though. There's nothing wrong with starting with this sizing on a jack high board and then going for bigger bets later. That's absolutely fine. You can make up for lost ground by overbetting turns and overbetting rivers and stuff like this if you need to, provided you have like kings and the board runs out really well. There'll be lots of runouts in which button wants to slow down, of course. So what's going on here is that button's range polarizes. When it polarizes, the equity increases very slight. The reason for that is that when you polarize properly, not just as an amateur poker player that has too strong of a range here for betting, and not as the other kind of amateur poker player that c-bets just everything, but as someone that's kind of a bit educated in poker, what you're going to do here is include lots of fairly bad hands in your range as well. So you're going to have a mixture here of value bets such as Jack X. Some 6x is kind of okay for value in this spot as well. You can even bet like some 10s and 9s for a small bet. 7s with a diamond, that sort of thing. So you don't have a fully polarized range here, but you're going to move towards like the stronger value hands, and then you're also going to move towards two types of unmade hand. Semi-value bets, which are like flush draws, so just very, very powerful. High EV hands, a flush draw here can have an entitlement of something like 90% pot, not in equity, but in EV, due to the implied odds being so high. Remember, hands can have more than 100% pot EV, not equity. And some very bad looking hands too. King 5 of hearts, for example, is supposed to be a really frequent c-bet in this spot, but if you give this spot to a beginner, they will either just routinely bet everything without thinking, or they will shy away. If they do start splitting their range, they'll start shying away from low equity hands. That's to say, they'll start favouring higher equity hands over lower equity hands when bluffing, which isn't really right. You want to be including both because you want your range to be the right strength, such that you can't be exploited by people overfolding nor people over defending. So what you'd want to do here as button is only have a slight increase in your equity when you're polarizing. That's what happens in GTO. If your equity increases massively here when you're betting, you're not betting enough bad hands, basically. Or maybe you're not slow playing enough top pair. You can slow play some top pair here, of course, right? You don't have to bet Jack 10. You don't have to make a value judgment on whether it's better to bet Jack 10 or not, because it's really just the same thing. Betting and checking are both fine. The thing that does increase a lot when button bets is the nut prevalence. And that's because when you polarize your range, you start to eradicate medium strength hands at a higher frequency than you would be eliminating other parts of your range. What this does is causes a spike in the frequency with which your range shows up with a very strong hand and allows you to then pot build massively from that point on using bigger bets in the turn and the river, because you're going to have a way more polar range than your opponent has after that. The next action here is that big blind calls the flop, and people have a very misled impression about what this does at grade 1 level. Calling the flop does not weaken your range. Sometimes people say, oh, his range is weak, he just called, he doesn't have a set, he's weak now. That's not really correct, because what's very important to understand about a range that calls the flop is the hands that are no longer a part of it, the hands that would have folded, that's to say, to the c-bet. So given that villain in the big blind would have folded the king 7 of clubs here, and many hands of that ilk, it's not fair to say that his range is weakened. It's fair to say that his range is capped. And when nut prevalence decreases massively, saying that the range is capped is a pretty apt description of that phenomenon. So definitely big blind is capping himself via this action, because 3s and 6s are both mandatory raises here, and Jack 6 is pretty mandatory too. That said, the range actually gets much stronger when big blind calls overall, not weaker, and that's because if you think about what has folded, and big blind will probably be folding fairly close to the pot odds norm fold equity here because this board is not that unfavourable. Big blind will be at a guess, I think, folding like 26-27%, I would think, to this small c-bet. And what are those 26-27% of hands? They're terrible hands, right? They're stuff like the King 7 of hearts. They're stuff like pocket deuces. They're stuff like Queen 10 offsuit, Queen 8 of clubs, that kind of thing. When all of those miserable hands hit the muck, the remaining hands are therefore much stronger as a unit. And what actually happens here, unbeknownst to a lot of people, is that the equity in big blind's range spikes so much upon not folding the flop, upon calling, that big blind now has a range advantage. That doesn't mean that big blind is going to be in a favourable world on the turn when the 8 of clubs comes down and big blind checks. This is actually a really good card for button. I should probably state that on this turn card, button's equity actually increases a bit. Not enough to become an equity favourite, but certainly increases a bit because an 8 is one of the main cards that gets folded by the big blind on the flop, right? Queen 8, 7 8, Ace 8, King 8, these are all hands that hit the muck at a very high frequency by and large. So there'll be another spike here that I've not represented on the graph because I was just trying to show what happens with actions here, but there'll be another small spike on the 8 of clubs. Another thing I would say about the 8 of clubs is that it's a card that does not equalize the nut advantage. So this nut advantage will actually, the nut prevalence will spike on some other cards. Big blind will regain an ability to hold his own with respect to nut advantage on certain cards, a diamond, a 5, a 4, a jack, a 6. These cards are going to help big blind's range catch up again. They're going to repolarize, if you will, big blind's range. The 8 is not. The 8 is going to leave it extremely capped. So the 8 is a card on which button will use very big sizing, and it's a card that helps button's EV more than it helps button's equity because it leaves the nuts really prevalent in button's range compared to the nuts in big blind's range. So while we're saying that big blind is now an equity favourite, because the nut advantage and the positional advantage are both firmly with button, button will be in a favourable world EV-wise on the turn, even though the equity of big blind's range is slightly higher than that of button's range now. That's the thing to understand about how we arrive at a turn barrel node. When we have the chance to barrel the turn, it's usually, not always, but usually the case that we have a slight range/equity disadvantage as the barreler or would-be barreler, but a firmly instantiated nut advantage and positional advantage. And what the latter 2 points do is put us in a favourable EV world for our range, even though our equity is slightly deficient now. And that's why on the turn, we know what range and nut advantage do from the previous lecture. That's why on the turn, we typically bet less often with a bigger sizing, don't we? Because we have a nut advantage, but not a range advantage. All makes sense. Hopefully, what this school is doing is slowly allowing you to tie things together into a cohesive web of ideas. A web of ideas which makes sense, where no one idea stands out like a sore thumb. Nothing is clashing with anything else that this course has taught you. You may find that concepts clash with what you previously believed, but that's not on me, that's on all the other people that taught you. So when we reach a blank turn, we arrive on a turn barrel opportunity with a large nut advantage, usually, not on every card, and a range disadvantage. This leads us to bet around 40 to 60% of the time, so a modest frequency, for a large sizing of B75. So sorry if that was a bit of a mind-boggling thing to look at first, but I hope it makes a lot of sense and it's clarified the landing situation for the would-be turn barreler, because without knowing what world that player is in, it's really hard to go ahead and argue for a strategy. So simplifying to one bet size, as we know, and as you'll know, if you've ever studied with a solver, if you haven't, that's fine too. You don't need to have to get a lot out of this course. But if you've seen solvers, you'll know that they will choose multiple sizes if given the chance in a lot of spots. If you go to a browser-based solver with pre-solved game trees, they may be solved with 5 or 6 sizes. That might actually mean that the solver is splitting a turn strategy between 4 or 5 sizes. They're using B50 sometimes, B70 sometimes, B90 sometimes, and overbet sometimes. Clearly this is not only a real pain for you to try to learn, it's also totally unnecessary. The amount of EV that you gain, theoretically speaking, not even in the real world, but in the theory landscape, by adding a sizing to your turn strategy and position is nothing. Take this spot, for example, the Jack 6-3 again with the 8 of clubs turn. We have the opportunity to barrel here as button. So when you give the solver the choice here, it will prefer, and I use prefer very, very hesitantly here in inverted commas, because solvers don't really prefer things. They just do whatever is microscopically best, even if the preference is like microscopic, it's minute. But the solver settles on mostly using B150 here. It sometimes uses other sizes as well if you give it loads of options. And when it settles on mainly using B150, this is in the default sim before I've done any restricting, given it a few bet sizes here, it says that the EV for button is 58.22% pop. Very favourable world, not because of range advantage as we saw in the previous slide, we don't have that, but the position and the nut prevalence give us a favourable world here for our range. Favourability is about EV. Range advantage is about equity. But when we restrict it to only using a smaller bet, we say solver, like I know you like the B150, it's your first choice, but sometimes the solver's first choice is like choosing one potato chip out of the packet instead of another. It's not a particularly important decision, you just grab one, right? But the solver chooses the biggest potato chip, it's that kind of guy. So anyway, it's chosen the B150 because when it compared the EVs in its original sim, it decided this was microscopically better to mainly use this sizing. That's just where it ended up when it ran its algorithm. And now I've given it a different set of inputs. So I've basically given it a different journey to a different, what I'd call a pseudo-equilibrium. It's a bit like a Nash equilibrium, which is a solution to a game in which neither player can improve their strategy and any change is more likely to be harmful than good, or it can't be good. And that's what the solver is aiming at when it runs its algorithm. And it then quotes a different EV. Similar, very similar, because it's a similar game tree. But it's not the same game tree. The journey has been different. And so the pseudo-equilibrium that we reach is also a bit different. The EV is now higher. This is just noise, this is coincidence. It doesn't really mean a great deal. You've just ran a different sim. You've restricted its options and the EV has gone up. It's not a perfect sim. In an ideal world, that wouldn't be possible, right? More options would always equal more EV. But because it doesn't run to like absolute perfection, there'll be fluctuation within the EV. But the main thing that we can safely say is that there is not likely to be any theoretically meaningful EV loss from using only a smaller size here instead of a bigger one, as long as we keep the rest of the game tree pretty standardized to what the solver is doing. So there's never a need in position to build more than one bet size into your strategy before the river. This is just factual. You can check as many different spots as you want in a solver and see what happens to the EV when you restrict options. And as long as you restrict options towards a fairly large size, you're not going to see EV loss. If you only give it the chance to bet 20% pot here, you're going to see EV loss. If you only give it the chance to check here, you're going to see EV loss because it has to check back a set now. That's horrible. But overall, it doesn't harm EV to slightly modify sizes and to eliminate unnecessarily numerous options of sizes from a sim. Simplifying to one size only here is definitely, in my opinion, in your best interest, not just for now, but for the rest of your poker career. You know we love fallacies in this school, right? Another fallacy that you hear is, okay, so I can simplify for now, but when I play high stakes, because everyone's going to play high stakes one day, everyone's going to play 5100 one day. People have high ambitions, in other words. You still don't need to build a second sizing there. I've talked with and worked with many high stakes players in the past, and a few of them will just only have one sizing in position for every street that's pre-river. River's a little bit different, and there you can get away with two sizes in position, maybe three out of position. But pre-river in position, one size is totally fine, and that's what we're looking at today mainly. Out of position, okay, when you get a bit stronger, there's options to add a second size, but it's still not necessary. I know strong players that just don't do that. They just play one size pre-river in all nodes. So what are some pros and cons of each of these options here? Again, I stress this, I highly recommend that you just pick one of these bet sizes or something in between if you want. Just make sure it's standardized and that you get used to it. What are the advantages of B150? What are the advantages of B75? Well, for B150, it's a more principled choice for a blank turn. This means that you kind of take the pressure off yourself by using this sizing. If you use B75, the amount of overbets you have to make later are a lot more, and they have to be a lot bigger. And that might be actually more awkward than just using a slightly bigger sizing immediately on the turn. The other thing about this is it actually sets up stacks for like reasonable jams on the river. It's principled because in spots where you have a large nut advantage, you do want to go for a bigger investment ceiling, so moving towards that more quickly does make a lot of rational sense for a human, rather than doing it in a unnaturally small and then unnaturally big way, which B75 would have to cater to. Secondly, this is less familiar to your opponents. If you're playing 2-5 in a casino in Vegas, let's say, and you're sat at the table with a few recs and a few people on their holiday just trying to have a good time, these amateur poker players and live pros will not have dabbled with overbets as much as like an online 500 Zoom reg on Stars or something like that. So you're going to see way more confusion, people being unsettled. You're going to ruffle their feathers, in other words, a lot more with the sizing. And of course, you're going to paint yourself to be an end boss. Only end bosses overbet, right? Of course not. but you're going to look cool. It's always good to look cool. In favour of B75, well, this is more familiar to you, and being able to play a good strategy yourself and not overloading yourself with unfamiliar stuff is really good. You don't want to be forcing yourself to play in ways that make your mental game shaky, that make you really uncomfortable, in ways that you just frankly haven't studied yet. And you want to add one piece at a time to your poker jigsaw. You don't want to do everything at once. So it's totally okay to use this sizing for now. If that's the level you're at, that's okay. It limits the amount of new things you need to learn. You might also be working right now on how to raise the flop. You might be revising lecture 6 on range advantage and nut advantage. You might have a lot on your poker to-do list. I know that I always do. You might want to restrict how many things you're doing at once. And thirdly, this is consistent with sizing for other spots. So not only delayed c-betting, as I've written here, in which I don't recommend overbetting. You can, but we'll leave that for now. But also some spots where you might just only be using B75 because the turn is highly equalizing to the nut advantage, and therefore you don't want to bloat pots as much. If you have a turn here like the 5 of diamonds, or any diamond, or any jack, or any 6, or even just a 5 or a 4, or a 7, you don't really want to be overbetting those turn cards. The turn cards you can overbet here are basically a king, a queen, a 10, a 9, an 8, a deuce, a 3, and that's about it. The other ones you probably want to be 75 anyway. So by rejecting overbets for now, you at least keep all of your turn c-bet sizes and delayed c-bet sizes consistent, and you can get really good at that one sizing. Learn where the kind of value thresholds are in different textures, the bluff thresholds, the showdown value thresholds. Learn how to craft your strategy for that sizing first. So it's up to you. I won't tell you what to do. I want to show you how to think, not just force you to play in a way that I say is correct. There's lots of ways you can play this turn spot. There's lots of different sizes you can use between about 2/3 pot and 2x pot that are fine. It's up to you how you want to craft it, but pick one and simplify the strategy as much as you can. So favorability isn't just a function of the turn card alone. The favorability, meaning the EV for your range and a turn barrel opportunity, is to do with the pre-flop ranges. They are the starting point. The flop and what that texture did to the situation, also the action sequence that happened on the flop, and also the turn card. So when you put all of these 4 pieces of the jigsaw together, you begin to develop a feel for what's happening in that world and how favourable it will be for your range. Using these factors allows you to practice sorting turn barrel opportunities into favourable spots, neutral spots, and unfavourable spots. When you can assign a label of favourability to a turn world, you will have an idea of, globally speaking, meaning for your range overall, how often you want to bet. This doesn't tell you to bet a hand or check a hand necessarily, but it gives you the overall benchmark for your range's betting frequency. This is a good starting point, and it allows you to then go from there and figure out which hands you want to pure bet, high frequency bet, sometimes bet, almost never bet, and never bet. So have a look at the spot, 5 deuce deuce, queen, pause the video, check call by big blind on the flop, and button has this turn barrel opportunity. Do you think this is favourable, neutral, or unfavourable? Write down an answer. Why not? Why is this world good or bad for button? Number 2, king 9 8. Do all of these actually, then we'll go over the answers. We have the 8 of hearts here. This is small blind versus big blind, so the out of position player in number 2 has a chance to c-bet the turn. Favourable, neutral, or unfavourable. I'll give you guys a clue. One of these worlds is favourable, one is neutral, and one is unfavourable. Remember, this always relates to EV, the full picture. Favourability is everything in the spot taken at once. It's a holistic assessment of the situation. And number 3, we have 8-7-3 two-tone, 5 turn. How good is this one for button? Back to in position now. Okay, I'm going to assume that you've written down some answers and thought about why, maybe even written down some reasons. I'm going to show you the answers now. So world 1 is favourable. The queen is an incredibly good card for button because the queen actually hits everything that big blind folded on the flop. Name some combos that cannot call a c-bet on 5 deuce deuce. Queen jack, queen 10, queen 9, queen 8, queen 7, queen 6, you get the picture. Lots of them. The queen, meanwhile, is a card that if button is constructing properly here, button will be bluffing some queen x combos, not just going, oh, I need a straight draw to bet, I need a straight or a flush draw to bet, and then accidentally betting way too high EV of a range. Stop doing that if you're doing that. Find some lower EV bluffs too. That's the only way to play a good strategy. And so the queen of diamonds turn is going to massively favour in position here. I would estimate, and you can check this in a solver, I don't have the data to hand, but I would estimate that button's EV is around 58, 59, 60% of the time. Something, 60% EV pot share, something like that. Button might even be an equity favourite on this card, or close to that, which is unusual after a flop c-bet gets called, but in this case it was just a small flop c-bet, so that doesn't cause that much filtering in the big blind's range. And then the queen turn, like I say, is just fantastic for button. It's really good for the in-position player. So favourable world, lots of betting, lots of bluffing, not being too selective, free reign to aggress a lot in this spot. World number 2 is about as grim as it can get. Not only has this card paired the bottom card, that's what we call a disaster turn for in position. A disaster turn is one which pairs the middle or bottom card. This is bad because when small blind bets the flop here, there's some degree of polarization in small blind strategy. Small blind is not going to be c-betting the flop with medium strength hands at the same frequency that they're going to be betting good and bad hands. Therefore, when the turn hits a lot of medium strength hands, like 8x, it's going to favour the big blind. This is the 8 of hearts though, and the thing about hanging around when you face a bet on the flop, the thing about calling a bet, is that unlike betting, you actually get rid of the bottom of your range, and you move towards stuff that have something to do with the flop, that in other words have a reason to hang around. So the flush card is usually going to favour the caller of the flop c-bet because their range was a bit more geared to hanging around because they like the flop than the better, whose range was more just polar, they either really like it or they don't. Although that's an exaggeration here, it's not that polarized to just make one c-bet, but it's moving in a polarized direction. These things are gradable, they're on a spectrum. So small blind wants to check this turn almost always. They want to slow play loads of their good hands because big blind will be betting a ton and applying a ton of pressure anyway in GTO. And there's just no need for small blind to do much betting here. The way this turn spot gets butchered by humans of a lower level, and by that I just mean people that aren't like solid professionals, is that they will play an underprotected checking range. They will just bet for value without thinking and meanwhile build a checking range that's just absurdly weak and overfolding dramatically. You're meant to be folding a lot here when you check in GTO. You're not meant to be meeting MDF, the mathematical defense frequency. You're meant to do tons of folding. But you're not meant to fold like 85% of your range, right? There are humans that do that, so be careful. Protect that checking range in an unfavorable world and consider check raising your bolts, your flushes, check calling your pair plus draw. Don't just value bet because you like your hand. Your range wants to check a lot, so check a lot. You don't donk bet the flop just because you flopped a set. Think about it, it's the same here. People are so bad for that. Like they would never donk bet like 2 pair on the flop just because they flop 2 pair. But then they go ahead and value bet all their flushes in this spot. It's horrible poker. It's really, really, really exploitable and very unnecessary and bad. Check a lot here. World 3, therefore, by process of elimination is neutral, but the reason it's neutral is that turn worlds are on average favourable for the in position player who has the barrel opportunity. Again, this is due to positional advantage and nut advantage, but the 5 is a below average turn card, which means that the world is now below average, which makes it a neutral world. Does that make sense? If the average world is slightly favourable for button, and this is a below average turn card, then this is a neutral world for button. Button will be a bit more selective on this card. Can still bet some pair draws, some overcards here. Button doesn't want to just be like, okay, I need a straight draw to bluff and hold themselves to a very high, unnecessarily strict standard for bluffing. But button, by the same token, isn't going to be bluffing with king deuce of spades here, I wouldn't think. Or something that just blocks folding range and has absolutely nothing going on and only one overcard. You have to be a bit careful in number 3, very careful in number 2. And in number 1, you can just bet whatever the hell you want as a bluff, as long as you don't do it like every single time. Because although you have a strong range in number 1, you probably can't support just betting always, but your range can support a lot of betting. So this is a really instructive exercise. Make a point to go back over this one. Being able to understand which kind of turn world your range is in is key to crafting a strategy in a turn world. Okay, let's talk a bit about attacking in favourable worlds now. How do we make the most of these spots? So in favourable turn worlds, we're able to bluff much less selectively, as we've seen, and should have usually a betting frequency of about 60% upwards. 60 to 70% of your range. That's a lot for the turn. On the flop, that's just like kind of normal. There's a lot of boards on which you can bet that often. For a turn world to be 60% or 70% c-bet though, you need to be doing incredibly well. Of course, we still need to build a polarized betting range and check our most middling hands, but the idea is that we have a much wider value range. We can be very aggressive for value because our opponent's range is so weak. And we can also just bluff a lot because we have so many value combos and the EV of bluffing is so high. The following world I'm going to show you is highly favourable, and our turn strategy is extremely aggressive therefore. We bet a lot of hands and can seek fold equity really often, with our air hands as well as our semi-bluffs. We want both, right? Not just the higher equity ones, but both. So the king turn, as a general rule, not on every texture, but on most textures, the king turn is insanely good for the in position player. It's one of these cards that just creates a big mismatch in terms of range versus range, and the king turn is actually going to allow button to become an equity favourite a lot of the time, which is really rare when you've already bet the flop and been called by your opponent, because your opponent has shed their weakest hands and you haven't. That's why it's bizarre to be an equity favourite, but when the turn is so lopsided like this, that it just truly favours one player way more than the other, that can happen. If you're an equity favourite and you have the usual perks of being in position with a nut advantage, your EV is going to be sky high. Button's EV here is 67.19% pot, meaning that the big blind range is only entitled to 1/3 of this pot in this spot. That's horrible, especially given that big blind has just strengthened their range by calling a flop c-bet. Yet they're still only entitled to 1/3 of the pot. That's how bad it is to be out of position on a horrible card, lacking both a range and nut advantage. Button's bet frequency is going to be really high. This is about as high as it gets for turn C betting. 72% is huge, and you're already getting enough fold equity here to just like profit, because no matter what you have, you'll break even from fold equity, and then you'll get on top of that the chance to hit a pair and win. Like even if you bluff here with Queen 4 of hearts, for example, like a really bad hand like that, which can bluff and should bluff often, that hand is going to get enough fold equity such that if it didn't have any outs, it would still be break even. But because it actually has outs, it's actually just a really, really winning bet. So Queen 4 of hearts here is a no-brainer high-frequency bluff because the fold equity is enough to just immediately return a break-even verdict, and then you have outs on top of that. So you are actually profitable here with Queen 4 of hearts. Your EV for betting is like highly plus EV. Checking is plus EV too, because you can like bluff the river or hit a queen or something by checking. But yeah, they're both fine, and you want to bet your bluffs often in spots where you have a ton of value bets. Also, you should note that because your opponent's folded a lot of King X combos on this turn, you can continue to value bet hands like Jack X really happily, because he's folded King X on the flop and doesn't have it on the turn, I should say. So here are some examples of how your range is going to play here. A hand like King Queen actually has to value bet. It's just too good now to slow play. It's got too much equity, and as we know, the urgency for fast playing your hand is more when you're in position, because you can't check raise. You'll go to the river if you check. So got to bet this one. This one you can still value bet, although you don't have to. It comes in at EV of only 74% pot instead of 121. Must check with eights, because even if a card is good for you, remember the range advantage equals bet, range disadvantage equals check fallacies from lecture 6. You don't bet a card just because it's good for your range. You still need to be polarized, and you do blunder EV. 3% pot to be precise in equilibrium if you're going to bet with eights here. It's too mediocre. Queen 10 you should bluff often. It surprises some people that you don't have to bluff this hand. It looks like the most natural thing to do. People are not very good at checking back this hand. I don't even think that humans check this back the 10% of the time that the solver does. Why is it okay to check? 1, you never get raised. 2, you can still bluff the river. 3, you can just draw to pairs and you want to be in a small pot when you hit a queen or a 10. And 4, you still have all of that equity and straight draw outs and nut potential if you check. So there are arguments for betting here, which are things like making the pot bigger for the times you hit a straight, getting fold equity, that sort of thing. There are arguments for checking, like not getting raised or hitting a 10 in a smaller pot instead of a bigger one and stuff like that. So actually it's not the case that you have to bluff these hands, but you should do it often to play a solid strategy, because you're value betting so often here. And then even trash can bluff. It'd be a big mistake to just only evaluate your hand. What a beginner does on this node is that he or she evaluates his or her hand strength without evaluating the range strength. So when your range is crushing your opponent's range, you're always allowed to bluff with random low EV hands. It's better to have Queen 10 than it is to have 10-7, but it's not better to bluff with Queen 10 than check, and it's not better to check with 10-7 than it is to bluff with 10-7. Hopefully that makes sense. Ace-5 is, I don't even know if I'd call that trash. I mean, it's kind of semi-trash. I like to differentiate between like what's total trash, like completely hopeless, and what's just semi-trash. Because in some worlds that are kind of neutral to unfavorable, you might be able to bet with semi-trash a hand like Ace-5 here, but not a hand like 10-7. Note that the EV of Ace-5 is slightly higher than 10-7, so they're not exactly the same strength of hand. If the world is neutral, then it's time to show a bit more restraint. Your bluffing can no longer just be completely rampant and out of control. You need to have a bit more of a standard. So when the turn is a card that connects with Big Blind's flop calling range a bit more than your range, and leaves your big over cards weak, the in-position player will find him or herself in a much more neutral world. The button, who's the in-position player in this case, will still have a range disadvantage, because when Big Blind calls flop, button gets a range disadvantage from Big Blind strengthening, but button will be surviving in EV due to the large nut advantage and the benefits of position. But they won't be thriving, because these neutral worlds are not turn cards that bail out their range like the big overcard queen was. So note that button's value betting threshold is now much higher, and his or her bluffs are going to be chosen more carefully. For example, the 4 of spades is a neutral world creating card. The average turn world is favourable for button, not in equity but in EV, remember. And because the 4 of spades is a below average card for button and therefore above average card for big blind, this is the zero-sum game of course, heads up pot, button is going to be merely surviving here. EV of 51.44% pot. Again, it's not a race. It's not about who wins the EV battle, which horse passes the finish line first. It's not about that. It's about the question of whether one player has a significant EV advantage or not. And the answer here is that neither player has that. So let's have a look at Button's bet frequency. What's happened? Well, it's gone way down. So the average world is favourable, and the average bet frequency is around 45%, 50%, something like that. Maybe a bit higher actually, depending on the configuration. Under the gun versus big blind's a bit different to button versus big blind, but on average, turn worlds are bet at around 40 to 55%, let's say. This one is neutral, and the average turn world is favourable. Therefore, this one is bet less than average and only 34% of the time. Big blind's fold percentage versus B75, as you can see here, is actually a little bit less than it was previously. Prior, on the horrible turn card for big blind, they were folding about 43% to this sizing. Now it's only 40%, and this is indicative of why Button has to be more selective when choosing bluffs, right? So even though this world is only neutral, there are still some value hands that are so big and benefit a lot by betting that they have to bet immediately in position. If we were out of position with these two queens, it may be permissible to check and check raise or check call depending on the opponent's sizing. But here we have to bet we're in position. We can't allow the river to come. But even a hand like ace-jack in a neutral world like a 4 turn is not a mandatory value bet. This hand blocks continues. It doesn't crave urgent value as quickly as queens does. It's a lower EV hand slightly, and it just doesn't have as many unblocked hands that it can get value from. The other thing that queens does is it blocks hands that villain would be bluffing on the river, whereas ace-jack doesn't. So ace-jack's a little bit better at sort of checking back and calling river, whereas queens just wants to rush the value now. Queen-jack is actually below the value betting threshold. This is probably where beginners go the most wrong. They play a very underprotected turn checking range in this spot because they're betting queen-jack again. Why are they betting queen-jack again? Unfortunately, it's because there's a huge misunderstanding in the poker community at the level of grade 1 and grade 2 as well, that flush draws are somehow forcing you to bet all your top pair. This is wrong. It's short-sighted, it's wrong. If you speak to any poker player that's been around the block professionally for a while, they'll tell you it's wrong, but nevertheless you'll see countless YouTube videos and Twitch streams where people just recite like zombies that they're going to bet top pair because there's 2 flush draws or 1 flush draw. Villain raises you here with a flush draw a lot in GTO, or they call you. So at best you're getting thin value. You're not getting denial of equity against the flush draw because flush draws don't fold this node. They usually have something else with them on a board like this, such as a pair or a straight draw, and they either raise you and you sometimes fold, or they call against you and they have a lot of equity anyway and they have implied odds and stuff. So I don't think that betting here just because your opponent has flush draws in their range makes any sense. It's short-sighted, it's tunnel vision, and it's even misunderstanding the one narrow part of the game tree that the student is looking at. Checking here is a function of equity. If we don't have the starting equity sufficient on the card that's bad for our range, like the 4 of spades with queen-jack, then we can't value bet queen-jack for our proposed sizing, which is B75 here. We just can't. Note that I've only given the solver 1 sizing in this spot. I've simplified the tree for you guys so that you can see something that's akin to how you should actually be playing and not some solver output that's going to bamboozle you with 5 different sizes. Your draws can bet, they don't have to. Another fallacy is that you've got to barrel with a flush draw. You don't have to barrel with a flush draw, you still have a flush draw if you check. You can still draw to a queen or an 8 if you check. Getting raised with this hand is bad. There are arguments for checking. And you shouldn't be betting a flush draw every time in a spot where your range is only betting 34% of the time. The way to think about it, if you want to play a more theoretically sound overall strategy, is that your draws are barreling a bit more often than your range, usually. That's usually the case, that your flush draws bet a bit more than your range bets globally, because your range wants to shift slightly more towards hands like that, in equilibrium. What you don't want to do is just always bet them. Same with your top pair. You overpair, okay, now you're at a point in your range where you have to bet. Semi-trash can bet here because it has useful blockers. You want to block these suits, guys. You want to. People get very confused here. They think, I don't want to block the flush draws. The flush draws are bad. No, the flush draws are good hands because they've not missed yet. When they miss their bad hands, you want to block them before they miss and unblock them after they miss. So basically, when you bet here with the king 8 with blue and black and villain calls, then all the draws miss because the river's a heart. Now you want to trade your cards in for 2 clubs or 2 hearts, right? At that point. Not right now, though. When villain has the king of diamonds in his hand here, he's very often going to have a draw that raises your bet here. So it's very good to not get raised when you have king high. So have the diamond, have the spade. Needless to say, in neutral worlds, there are some hands that are too bad to bluff with. This is not the case in favourable worlds. You can bluff anything you want. Who cares? Now, it's semi-reasonable to impose some standards on yourself up to a point, but do differentiate between trash and semi-trash. 9-7 here does have a draw, but the reason I've called this hand trash is that it's trash for betting. because what this hand does is block folds and highly unblock raises. So you get raised a lot more in a way that's harmful for you when you get made to fold your pair draws and straight draw here. With king 8, you're happy to bet fold, you don't care, and you're blocking the raises anyway. It's a bit misleading maybe to say trash and semi-trash for these hands respectively, but I mean in terms of betting. Okay, unfavourable worlds now. This is where you have to be much more picky. So when we're out of position, our EV will always be lower. We're way more likely to be in an unfavourable world when out of position, and in fact, most of the unfavourable worlds in the game tree exist out of position. And these exist when a card comes when you're out of position that connects well with villain's flop calling range, and in these cases we're going to want to check at a high frequency, protect our checking range massively, value bet only very strong hands, and be very strict about our requirements for bluffing. Sucks, right, to be in an unfavourable world, but this is what you've got to do. So blind versus blind, ace 6-3, 6 of clubs, nightmare turn, absolute disaster show of a turn. Small blind is going to be relatively okay on the flop. Not doing great, but maybe in like a neutral world out of position. Not betting this flop super often. The 6, the 3, the two-tone nature. These things are not good for small blind. Being out of position sucks too. Big blind calls onto the turn and the EV is now 47.46%. Remember that small blind still has a lot of really powerful hands pre-flop that big blind doesn't have, like 2 really big clubs or boats. So small blind still has technically some nut advantage, although it's been neutralized massively by this card. The problem is that being out of position with an equity disadvantage is going to give you negative EV even if you have some small nut advantage. So small blind's bet frequency is almost nothing, 20%, and big blind's fold percentage now is again lower than the pot odds norm. But the thing is here that's really crucial to understand, you might be thinking, but Pete, why is big blind not folding less than this if the world is so good for them? The world is only really good for big blind before small blind has bet. That's the lens we're looking at this hand through. After small blind bets, what happens is that small blind polarizes their range. They eliminate a load of garbage that would have been too weak and too hopeless to bluff with, like the total trash combos. Small blind is not betting here with a hand like Jack 5 of diamonds, right? This hand is a give up out of position in an unfavourable world. And therefore, big blind is only in a favourable world until small blind bets. When small blind bets, it changes. So big blind's range advantage and favourability here mainly exist after small blind checks. But because small blind will have to check 80% of the time, that's why it's so good for big blind. After the bet's been made, big blind in equilibrium is assuming that the small blind opponent has the sense to craft a relatively polarized and selective betting range. That's why big blind doesn't overdefend to this turn bet. So there's nothing that you have to value bet here. It's a complete nonsense to say that you have to value bet the 6 of clubs turn with any hand, because betting isn't the only way of getting value. You know, expand your thoughts a bit here. If you're sat here with a nut flush or 3s full or aces, you don't have to bet. You can check. Your opponent likes this world. They'll be doing a lot of betting. You can check raise. Whenever you can check raise, you usually don't have to bet, unless you have a bad hand that's not so good to check raise but needs to bluff now. But with a value bet, you rarely need to actually do it out of position pre-river, unless you're in a really favourable world where your opponent won't be doing much betting. Then maybe you do have to. So ace queen can value bet here. It doesn't have to, it's a thin value bet. It gets maybe a little bit of useful fold equity, but mostly it's just a value bet that's thin. The thing about being out of position is it's not very good to check either, so both plays kind of suck here. Only 60% pot for top pair, that's not great. Ace 10 is below that threshold and according to the solver must check, although betting out of position is not that different to checking, so it wouldn't be a disaster to bet ace 10. This hand can bluff sometimes, and it should bluff more than the global frequency because of its pair draws and flush blocker and flush draw. And then this sort of hand should never bet. It's an EV loss to bet a hand like 10-8 here. Hopefully you can see that as we move from an unfavourable world through to a favourable world, the standards for bluffing are relaxed. More hands become value bets. Out of position is less favourable in general and more things are slow played. And you can see now that if you don't think about the world and only play your hand, you end up playing absurd poker, right? But that's what a lot of your opponents are doing. They're not thinking about the range. It's so important to understand poker from a theoretical basis so you can just see everything for how it is. You can have a true view about what's going on. The ace turn fallacy is the idea that it's easy to imagine that an ace turn will be good for the flop C better. But this isn't always the case. Think about a very wide range encounter like blind versus blind, for example. The pre-flop caller there will have a ton of ace X, not just suited but offsuit too. Generally speaking then, a 10, jack, queen or even a king tends to be more favourable for a c-better in one of these really wide range encounters than an ace, because the pre-flop caller will have folded many of the lower broadways on the flop but not the ace X, which calls for showdown value. This is of course sizing and board dependent. If I 2x pot the flop, the ace is probably a better turn for me. If I b33 the flop, big blind continues a ton of ace X. So this is not a particularly good world for small blind. I would not be super happy on the turn in this world in general. but we don't know what the turn is yet, of course. We're just looking at all possible turns here. So although this is a good spot in general for small blind's range, the thing is that we need to understand that the ace turn is not particularly great. If the turn is an ace, it's actually going to be the worst turn in the deck for the small blind. Still, it's okay, because like the pre-flop advantage still carries over here. This is EV, by the way, not equity we're looking at here. Equity would be less good. So the ace is still a favourable world, because all turn cards are favourable here after 7-7 deuce. It's just such a hard board to hit. It really preserves the pre-flop status quo quite a lot. And EV is, not just about equity here, which will be lower, it's about nut advantage too. But the ace turn is going to be the worst one. This is called a hotness map in Pile Solver. I prefer heat map, sounds more grammatically correct, but there you go. You can see that the best turn cards here, EV-wise, are actually the Queen, the 9, the 7, and the 6. These are cards that are very likely... Well, the 7 is a unique case. It basically just bolsters nut advantage so much that the overpairs become invincible in small blind's range, and big blind 7x becomes like too scarce to matter. But the reason the Queen is so good is that while the 10 and the Jack will be continued sometimes for backdoor straight draw reasons, the Ace and the King will be continued for showdown value reasons by big blind on the flop, the Queen will be the most folded over card. And it really is true that the cards your opponent is meant to part with on the flop at the highest frequency are going to constitute the best turns for your range. So have a look at this hotness map, try and understand what's going on here. And remember that in wide range configurations, your opponent does call the bigger broadways the ace, the king, more than the lower ones. So the ace and the king are the worst cards here for small blind's range, kind of paradoxically. We lose a lot of both range and nut advantage on the ace because the overpairs are going to get basically ruined a lot of the time. Ace-X is just super prevalent here, pre-flop and on the flop. Okay, so protecting our checking range is a really common motif in poker that the beginner fails to do. When you watch like a live poker vlog, no offense to these people, but what you're seeing is generally fairly low level theoretical poker. People don't have much idea what's going on in like an average live vlog that you would watch. And they are kind of usually discussing poker in the sense of repeating axioms that they've heard other people around them say, and just say stuff that's just very flawed, in my opinion. But the biggest thing that you see is that a live player, or even like a low stakes online player, will correctly identify that when their opponent checks out of position when they didn't have to, that their range is really capped, but it shouldn't be. It should not be. That's not okay to just accept that as normal, because theoretically it's horrible, but it's normalized because humans don't protect their checking ranges enough. This is the biggest and most common way in which a human deviates from a solver output. So having a protected range is an important part of playing a theoretically sound turn strategy, especially out of position, where, as I said, if you can check raise, it's usually okay to do so, you don't have to bet. So the positional trapping rule is that in position on the turn, your checking range as a flop c-better should be capped. You're not meant to be uncapped in position, because there are certain hands like the queens that we saw on the jack-high flop previously that just have to value bet. But there should be some pretty good hands still in there. Remember the ace-jack was checking on the Jack 6-3-4 double flush draw. You should still have some quite good hands in there. But when you watch a poker player who's not an expert discuss poker, they don't even take issue with the fact that they think their opponent's range doesn't have much top pair. When they check back the turn, that's normalized, but it's not okay. Not all of the things that are normal or run-of-the-mill are okay. Think about ethics. How many things used to be accepted as just completely fine, like women weren't allowed to vote. And we just accepted this, oh, that's normal. Women accepted it, some of them. Men accepted it, some of them. Because it was just the status quo. That didn't make it right. And there's still tons of things in our society that we have to fix and blah, blah, blah. I digress, but the point is, in poker, there's all this bad stuff that goes on that's just taken as normal because it's done by every human. But it's not okay when you start studying the theory of the game and working with solvers. Out of position, your checking range should be really protected. It should be really uncapped. And you will even want to check some nutted hands at a reasonable frequency because, again, if you can check raise, it's okay to do so. That's the point. Unless you're playing against someone that doesn't bet enough and just doesn't open the action and you're not going to be able to slow play against them. But overall, it's totally okay to play this way. So small blind versus big blind now. Let's say that we have a hand like jacks or deuces on this turn. A really nutted, powerful hand with c-bet flop, big blind's called. Turn barrel opportunity. Look how often the solver checks these hands. And it's not to say it's better to check. The solver's not an idiot. If it's better to check it, the solver's never going to bet. It's not going to be like, okay, I'll do something terrible a third of the time, as long as I'm not doing it more than that. That's stupid. That's not how poker works. If something's bad, you don't do it. There are no loss leaders. We've talked about this. So in the solver's mind, it's okay to check here. Not good, not bad. It's just okay to do it because you can check raise and because your opponent will be betting sometimes. Think about the hands that people list when they use the targeting fallacy. We're targeting Jack X. We're going to bet here to target Jack X. No, bad. Why is it bad? Because Jack X bets anyway. Wouldn't you rather check raise? They don't consider that. So check raising here is totally fine. You're out of position. Your range will be betting maybe, I don't know, 40, 50% of the time out of position. The Jack's a great card for you, sure, but the world is not that favorable. It's only about 56% EV. It's good, but it's not like amazing. So you want to protect your checking range to some extent, and you want to slow play these hands. In position, there are limits. On a flush turn though, a queen high flush like this, like the second nut flush, is not that great. It's a good hand, but the thing is that flushes suck at getting value. So button is allowed to slow play a queen high flush here, not a king high flush that's too nutted. The urgency is too high for that one, that has to bet. But the queen high, jack high, six high flush, these are meant to check back a ton. How often do your opponents find these checks? Never, right? Practically never. People play very badly on the turn. It's one of the spots that they understand the least well, and it skews their ranges forevermore for the rest of that hand. When your opponent checks back this deuce of clubs turn on the right hand side, and you know that they have no flushes, there are ways you can really increase the EV of your strategy above and beyond what it would be in theory because of this. So it's not okay to play stupidly underprotected turn ranges and value bet every hand that's good enough to value bet because you're brain dead. It's not okay just because it's normalized. In the same way that tons of stuff that's happened throughout the course of humanity was not okay, even though it was normalized. Don't tell anyone though. This is our secret. You bought this course, you deserve this. You don't have to go away and start berating your opponents and telling them to have protected checking ranges, but be aware of how underprotected they are in this spot compared to what theory would say. Okay, deciding whether to barrel unmade hands, basically bluff selection, the final part of today's video, and one of the most important roadmaps for thinking about turn play in general. Here is a lovely little guide. Okay, it's a giant guide, and it's very cluttered, but it's very useful. Let's break our unmade hands, aka our bluff candidates, down into 5 categories. Premium draws, like open-end straight draws, flush draws. These are mammoth hands. They're very high EV. Clearly, if you only load up your betting range with these, you're not really bluffing enough. You're just semi-bluffing really high EV hands anyway, and you're going to be a nit, and people should just fold against you. So also have decent draws like good gutters, 2 overcards. Have marginal draws too if you're not in a terrible world. Bad gutter, 2 overcard pair draw, 1 overcard flush draw blocker, something like that. Semi-trash, maybe just 1 over. It's not nothing. You still have an out against a pair. And utter trash, 0 overcards, like the crappy 10-8 that we looked at before in that horrible spot where we had to give up. There's a time and a place to bluff all of these hands, and there's a time and a place to be very selective. If you have a premium draw, you can bet in any world. You can bet in an awful world, an unfavorable world, a neutral world. It doesn't matter. Your hand is so high EV that it doesn't matter how strong your opponent's range is. You can still get away with betting this hand. It's okay. But when you only have a decent draw, you might not be able to bet in some really awful worlds. There are some turn probe opportunities, for example, for the big blind, where they actually need an open-end straight draw plus to start bluffing. It's crazy, right? But that can happen if the EV is super low and the opponent's range is way stronger than yours. With marginal draws, you can usually bet, but if the world is unfavorable, you might not be able to, but usually it's fine. Semi-trash can bet, but only in amazing worlds and favorable worlds, and utter trash can only bet in amazing worlds. That's how it goes on a turn. It's very simple. There's a lot of data here, but it's a very simple pattern, which once you learn, it's really hard to forget, and this will just help you out. So let's start the turn thought process by always asking, how favorable in EV is this world for our range? That's a function of all the factors we looked at previously: pre-flop configuration, flop texture, flop action sequence, turn texture. And when we get really good at that, and if you have a solver, you can look at EV in a solver and predict it and see how good you get and just keep practicing. Then you know how to split up your bluffs. This is a really eye-opening lesson for a lot of students, and most people having watched this video realize just how badly they've been butchering the turn. But that's a good thing, because realizing that you've been butchering a spot is much better than not realizing that you're butchering that spot. Your opponents will continue to mess this up. Look to exploit them when you're the person facing the bet. They're under-bluffing so many turn spots because they're being so strict about what hands they need. Not always, not everyone, but general micro-stakes player, 1-2 live player, just fold your bad bluff catchers that are meant to be break-even when you suspect your opponent's being too nitpicky about what to bluff. Okay, homework task 7. Let's read this and then pause and have a go at it before I go over the results. For the following spot, I'd like you to give an example of a hand that constitutes A, the bottom of your value range for B75ing, so the weakest hand that you're allowed to mix any value bet with for B75, 3 different hands with which bluffing is optional, meaning okay, but not forced, and C, a hand that must be checked due to being too mediocre. Write down an answer for question 1, A, B, and C, and question 2, A, B, and C. I'll go over it now, I may not name the same hand as you, just make sure that you've written down a hand that's similar to the ones I name. Okay, I'll assume you've had a go at this now. Let's go over the answers. So question 1A, a hand that is the bottom of your value range for B75. This would be like one of the best possible one pairs. Small blind versus big blind here, I wouldn't want to be barreling too much absolutely bad naked king X for B75. I mean, you could, but I'd probably go smaller with that if I was betting. I would say that a really good king like ace king, king 10, king 9, something like that. 3 different hands that bluffing with is optional, probably gut shots of any description, open-enders of any description. There would be a limit here. This is a decent world for small blind with 3 high cards, but it's not like the best ever, so you probably don't want to bluff with absolute nothing. But I would say hands that is optional would be like any ace-x combo, 9x combo, 10x combo, 2 spades obviously. Maybe some weaker hands too. Maybe some like set draw low pocket pair hand like deuces in this situation, possibly. Wouldn't be betting deuces on a blank turn, but on a queen it goes way down in showdown value, much closer to a bluff. A hand that must be checked due to being too mediocre. This would be something like queen 6, like a hand that just doesn't have enough EV to bet for value and is miles away from a bluff. Question 2, bottom of the value range for B75 here on the 10 turn, probably something around ace 10, pocket jacks, bad queen, somewhere around there. 3 different hands with which bluffing is optional. This is a really good turn card for a button. Hope you picked up on that. Really favorable world, this one. So you can bluff with 6, 7, ace deuce, king 6. You can also bluff with like king 9, king jack, flush draws, the obvious things too. Just go nuts. Favorable world. You can bluff with basically anything. If there's a hand to not bluff with, it might be like the 9-8 of diamonds that blocks folding range, unblocks raising range, and doesn't want to get raised off of a bad gutter. So maybe 9-8 of diamonds or 9-7 of diamonds or something like this can check pure, meaning all the time. C, a hand that must be checked due to being mediocre, pocket 7s, pocket 5s, bad 10x, hands like this. Okay guys, hopefully you got a feel for that. Feel free to look those up in a solver and check out my answers and check out your own answers, see how we did. But that's my attempt at it. I didn't want to just show you a sim. I'm trying to avoid in the Carrot Poker School just being like, look, here's a sim. There's way too many videos where people are just trawling through solvers. I want to show you how I think about it, like in real time. So I'll see you back here for lecture 8 when you're ready. Go over this one again. It's a very dense and important lecture. And I hope you're enjoying the course so far. See you soon. Bye for now.